Something like a skylight or reflecting pond or garden or roof garden, these are all things that are just going to actually heighten the emotional connection between the viewer and the image. So they're both sustainability strategies, but like I mentioned, they are actually things that are going to create more compelling images, more interesting storylines, and more opportunities to find a way to really get into someone's heart through the imagery.
As you know, I have a very clear mission with Building Green, and I know so many brilliant architects, interior designers, and contractors who do too, but they're still stuck working on projects that drain them, with clients who don't value what they bring. That's why we founded Market Your Architecture a year ago. It's a marketing agency that helps mission-driven designers attract better clients, charge what they are worth, and finally build the kind of portfolio that reflects who they really are. If that sounds like the shift you need, there's a link in the description to marketyourarchitecture.com. And before we jump into the podcast, please rate and subscribe. It really helps me reach more people like you. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipp, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. How do you sell a dream when the project doesn't exist yet? That's exactly the question I wanted to be answered by Lucas Posada in this episode. After 2 decades of being a sustainable architect in New York, he stepped out of traditional practice to co-lead the New York office of Bloom, one of the world's leading architectural visualization studios. Today, Lucas helps tell the story of architecture, but not by describing it or drawing plans, but by making you feel it through his images. He's worked on some of the biggest and most important projects currently, from the water resilience plans in Manhattan to the climate exchange on Governor's Island, helping some of the world's biggest firms like Big, OMA, SOM, and HDM distill their vision into just a few unforgettable images. In this episode, we explore what it means to sell sustainability through images and emotions, why good architecture always starts with courage, and how a single rendering actually has the power to change the city's future. Let's dive in. Lucas, it's a pleasure having you here on Building Green. Before we go into the topic of sustainable architecture and everything you do, take me back for a moment and tell me about your journey so that I understand what pulled you from 2 decades of architecture into the world of visualization.
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, excited for the conversation. So I was thinking about this a little bit this morning, and my journey really started. It's kind of a combination of kind of like all of my experiences. I was originally born in Medellin, Colombia, and kind of grew up there for a few years before moving to California and then Oregon, which is where I studied architecture. I went to high school and studied architecture in Oregon, and really went there because it was like a good architecture school, and it was kind of like the hometown school, University of Oregon. And I think that's where I first heard about any of the ideas of sustainability. Oregon is very much known for being a program that focused on sustainability and all things quote unquote green, as it were. And it wasn't just sort of like taught. It was very much about like kind of lifestyle, Eugene, Oregon, known as like the sort of hippie town USA or whatever. So then I practiced architecture in Portland, Oregon, which is where I started my career, and really learned about sustainability there, really more from like a systems kind of approach. Like it was a little bit of sort of how can buildings be high performing buildings. And that's when like LEED was really going on, the Living Building Challenge, like all of those things were really much what people were focusing a lot on. And then I moved to New York City in 2015 and started working with more Sajmi architects, where it was less of this sort of like green quote unquote movement that's kind of very on the nose sometimes. It was more about sort of sustainability through the lens of like cities and like historic neighborhoods within cities and like historic fabric and like the idea of preservation as a sustainability strategy. So all of those influences for me have kind of like brought me to where I am today, sort of leaving the formal capital A architecture world and sort of moving into a lane that's slightly adjacent to it, which is the world of visualization. But I mean, all of those experiences still really inform what I do every day in the visualization world. And I mean, to me, it's this balance of just like sort of this holistic approach to integration with nature, high performance systems, cities, urbanism, history, preservation. There's like so much that I can talk about, all of those themes, and then they all sort of like link together in some interesting way or another. So yeah, that's a little bit of sort of like my own personal journey and how I sort of landed from formal architecture kind of into the rendering world.
And now you work with the biggest architecture firms like Big, HDM, I think even SOM, OMA, even Barozzi Vega. I applied there for an internship while I was studying architecture in Zurich. What does your day actually look like now compared to when you were practicing architecture?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, you know, when you practice architecture, you either have a very specific and sort of narrow role on one thing, or you have a very kind of broad role. But even someone that owns an architecture company and is maybe somehow involved in like all projects, it's really hard to do a lot of projects in a year as an architect, right? Like the projects take a long time. They take a long time to get built. They take a long time to design. So a typical project is like, I don't know, a year to 3 years to 5 years. I mean, there's projects that I worked on that have been around for like 8 or 9 years, you know, because they just go on hold and this and that or whatever. So like now my day to day, as like existing in the visualization world, where we're not like designing buildings, but we're creating sets of images, and our architects are like our clients. We get so much more exposure to a range of projects. I mean, we do, just our New York office does, you know, 150 projects a year or something like that. So we do hundreds and hundreds of images, and each one is a 2 or 3 week project where we get to like embed ourselves and in a really incredibly kind of like intimate way, because like our job in many ways is to find the heart and soul of the architecture and then try and tease that out and sort of like represent that through the images. So we have this like incredibly intense relationship with these projects for a very short period of time. And then we sort of move on with our life, and then we do it again. So we do that, and then we kind of drop in and do it again and do it again and do it again and do it again. So over the span of a year, like we actually get exposure to a much broader range of what's happening in the design world, working with various architects, developers, and really like every day we're spanning the globe and different typologies and different clients and everything. So that's been the number one change, kind of going from architecture to visualization, is that you just get so many more reps. You know, you get so many more chances to practice what it is that you're doing. And with that, you get more chances to like refine what it is that you do. You know, so every single project is like, we just make a little slight adjustment, you know, turn a little knob here, a little dial there, and then see like, oh, okay, how could we have done that a little bit better? And then it's this gradual process of refinement, which we used to do this thing where we would do like a postmortem or a download after a project was done and just say like, okay, we issued a major set of drawings. We just finished DD. Like, let's all sit around and like talk about like what we could have done better, or what we could do, you know, what we could do better next time, what worked well, how is that going to kind of inform our process. We do that a handful of times in a year. And in many ways, we're doing that almost on a daily basis, where we're just sort of like constantly trying to make the machine kind of work a little bit more efficiently, a little bit more better, and just kind of continually dialing things in, which is really I think, an incredible privilege for anyone that's like a designer or an artist or whatever. Just the ability to like practice and be prolific in what you do is the greatest privilege that you have, right? Because without that, it's hard to get better at anything. It's hard to like make the process better or ultimately the product better.
That's so cool, especially looking at or comparing it to architecture projects. First, they usually take a few years, and then it also takes you a few years until you can implement what you've learned from the last project. So that's a really cool point. And another point I want to discuss, we've talked about this earlier as well. You and your team, create thousands or hundreds of images every year. I think you said even thousands across all practices. And from where you sit, you really get to feel kind of the pulse of the industry, right? What trends or shifts are you feeling most clearly right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the biggest sense that I get from, it's like literally my job to like be talking to other architects all day. And so I get in some ways a much better sense of what's going on within an architecture firm than I did when I was working within an architecture firm, because your job is kind of like to talk to developers and structural engineers and landscape architects and things like that. So I think right now there is a lot of, uncertainty about how technology is changing our world. And I think, in a superficial way, it's like, how is AI going to come after all of our jobs? It's like that, but it's also like just the culture of how projects are financed, how clients engage with projects, the way that money moves through the industry, like all that is like changing and evolving. And it has been for a long time since like, there were major technological updates from the change from like AutoCAD to BIM. And so that kind of forced firms to think about how do you deliver a project slightly differently. And then COVID happened. And then sort of since that and all the economic downturns, the biggest change that I remember, being in the industry is that you used to kind of work on projects and then they would like start and then they would go on for a long time. And then at some point it just got to where like you'd be released for one phase and then maybe we'll see if we'll go into the next phase. And then, this kind of like start and stop. And then you'd kind of get halfway through the phase and then you'd have to stop. And then the client was either like reprogramming or they were like going to finance it a different way. And so then you take one step forward and two steps back. And I think that trend, which I think started maybe after the financial crisis of like 2008, really accelerated obviously during COVID. And then I think there's another wave of that now as technology is like changing everything, right? It's changing our industry literally week to week, like the advancements in kind of our hardware and also our software and then the AI sort of inputs. Like we're doing things today that didn't even exist 6 months ago and that are just part of our workflow. And so it's changing what we do, but it's also changing the financial markets. It's changing the way that institutions think about their own longevity. So it's not just privately funded things. It's publicly funded things. It's universities. It's museums. Everyone is sort of like rethinking the way that everything works. And I think when you feel that, it maybe feels a little bit like uncertainty. And that kind of affects all of us because people are a little bit like sort of cautious. And so sometimes bringing it back to what we do and how our conversations, like our interactions with our clients, is sometimes like we feel a little bit of responsibility to kind of like encourage our clients to just be bold, to just sort of like take a stand and have a point of view and like express what it is that they want to do as architects. Because sometimes we'll get a brief that's like, oh yeah, we kind of like need a couple images, but we're maybe thinking like just one image and maybe make it a little sketchy because we're not sure if that's the thing or whatever. And sometimes we have to be like, let's just commit. Let's do more images and have them be more detailed and more realistic and more emotional. And let's actually like focus on how to take your ideas and just like stand behind them and have a point of view and have like some courage behind that, which is, I think, really, really difficult in a uncertain world. But I have this conversation all the time with my partner, JP, who runs the New York office with me. I'm like, if we're not doing that in a meeting, if we're not trying to find like the heart and soul of this and bring that to the front, like who else is? Like that in some ways is our job, to be there and be like, these two images are everything, right? The whole world is going to judge their whole impression of this project is like these two images or these three images. Like, let's make sure they're as good as possible and not pull any punches. So that's kind of where I'm feeling things are right now, generally across the board.
You said so many interesting points. Do you feel responsible for how the city is going to change in the next, I would say, 10 to 20 years? It almost sounded a bit like that.
I think it's like a shared responsibility, especially like in a city like New York, where the email chains are like 20 or 30 or 40 people on these projects, right? They're just like these huge teams. There's so many stakeholders, and I think we all have like a huge shared responsibility. So in some ways it comes back to like shared values that we have, especially like I think a lot about the New York projects that we do that tend to be like big and impactful, and like the projects that are going to define the next generation of like what the city looks like and how it functions and things like that. And yeah, I mean, our sliver of the whole, our portion of a $500 million infrastructure project that is like the new waterfront resiliency plan for all of Lower Manhattan. Yeah, our portion is like pennies. You know what I mean? It's like nothing. But I think our responsibility is, one, kind of contractually, like our job to make those images, but it's also like you also have this responsibility as a sort of like a citizen, as a person who lives in the city, who cares about the city, who like also has an opinion on that. And sometimes especially on the New York projects, I find myself speaking out of like sort of both sides, right? I'll be like, okay, from an image making point of view, we're like, this is me as Lucas from Bloom. I think this is the right approach, but also like from just someone who like lives in New York, like here's my opinion, on this stuff. So sometimes I find myself kind of giving two different sets of opinions, and most of the time they're like aligned, but sometimes you'd be like, oh yeah, this is like going to make a really cool image, but like whatever, that's going to mess up my bike lane or cause more traffic, or, the things that you care about as like as someone that has to like interact with this thing. But I don't know. I think first of all, it's great fun to work on projects here in New York. And I'm very thankful for like how fun our job is when we get a brief that's like, hey, here's a new RFP for like a massive high-rise building at the base of the Brooklyn Bridge. And then we get to like visualize that. It's incredibly fun. Like, don't get me wrong. It's very, very, very cool. And then you kind of have to like just treat it as fun, but then also be like, okay, I actually have like a civic responsibility for this in one way or another, because you can't just like ignore that these projects exist within the broader context of like millions of people.
I think that's a cool part of our job, that we have these both sides, our architecture or designer hat and our citizen hat. And if we don't care, who else will care, right? You said what's changed is kind of the way projects are financed, or that whole trajectory. How has that changed for architects, and what are they doing or should they do differently now compared to a few years back?
I mean, my perspective is so narrow, right? It's just based on my own personal experience. But like, if you go way back, it just like the process was so linear, right? It was like you did schematic design, then design development, or like bid drawings, and then the drawings went out to bid, and then they came back, and then you just moved through this thing, and then the thing got built. And I think it's just become so fragmented. So I think in that kind of fragmented process where, like, I think for everyone, it's just made all of the work more piecemeal. And so I think it's hard for an architect to sort of lean in more, and for us to like, I think it's just a little bit harder when everything is so piecemeal. And I think people are sometimes gun shy, or like sort of unsure of, do we sort of like go for it because things might change, or there might be like a change order, or they're like, we're unsure. So I think that, that's something that actually like my training as an architect and like working on big projects informs a little bit of the way that I approach the visualization work, because I think you have to try and take everything as seriously as possible and just kind of like go for it. And I would say that's been a big difference too for me personally, is that you're so afraid as an architect running a team on a big project of 15 people or 10 people or 5 people even, that you're going to get that call from the client that says, oh, this is good, but we're actually like adding a floor, or we're going to add more square footage, or we're going to reduce it, or like the site actually is changing. Like you, in some ways, dread those calls, right? Because they mean like changes, and how do you staff this up, and how do we keep the schedule, and are they going to pay us for this, or is it like an ad service, or all these things. Like they can be very, very challenging. In some ways, that's part of the job. But since moving to this side of the business, we're so much more nimble in what we do. And, you know, all we do is really pixels at the end of the day. So you're like, our ability to change things is much faster. So you kind of embrace change. So I've had to like reframe a little bit of how I think about those interactions with our clients. And Christian, who's the founder of our company, has a very good way to think about it. He's like, if the client's feedback is going to make the images better, then we should never be upset about that. And we sort of embrace that as a very sort of Zen approach, which is, there's very little about being an architect in New York that is sort of Zen, but that is a very peaceful way to think about the evolution of a project from beginning to end. Is if the feedback and the inputs that you're receiving are making the project or the images better, then why would you ever be upset about that? And sometimes we focus so much on, well, are we going to get reimbursed for this, or are we going to get paid for it, or we don't have time for this, well, whatever. So when you can kind of exist in a world where it's just kind of binary, it's like, well, if it's going to be better, then we should just embrace it, because we'll be happier with the product at the end of the day. So then it's kind of nice. So I think that's something that I'm thinking about a lot sort of nowadays in my day-to-day, is just how do you take this fragmented, piecemeal, uncertain world in which we all live in all aspects of our culture and our society, and then just try and find a little bit of like peace and calm within that, right? And just say, okay, well, we have a brief, we have to create images. Let's make them as beautiful as possible. And let's not pull any punches. Let's not be afraid of if the things change or if the scheme is going to go right. Let's just try and do as beautiful of images as we can, and just give the thing a chance of living by what we do, which is just like, if we can create images that are inspiring and beautiful and interesting, then that's everyone's best shot of just having a moment to reflect and say, oh, wow, yeah, that is really cool. And that's another great privilege of what we do, is that if we can create the cool images or the beautiful moments, if we can find those and we can bring those out, that's often what everyone who does so much work, whether it's engineering or finance or development or procurement or design or architecture or the technical aspect, everyone kind of looks at the renderings and is just like, yeah, that's the project. You know, someone rarely pulls up the waterproofing details from the roof and is like, this is my favorite project that I ever worked on, right? Even if that's the part of the building that they did, they pull up the renderings and they're like, that's what they remember of that. So that's in some ways, that is a huge responsibility that we feel, right? It's like, whether it's the first impression or the lasting impression, so much of what we do is about creating that impression for the architect and for the architecture and for the landscape and for the interior. So I guess in some ways, not to get too like self-aggrandizing, but like, as the world gets more uncertain and our industry becomes more uncertain, our role becomes in some ways more important, because our job is to like bring clarity to all that, right? To bring like focus around what is it that everyone is trying to do. It's this. And we have found in general, another thing that's very cool about what we do is that once you kind of create that initial impression, schemes change and plans change and buildings get bigger and bigger or smaller. The images kind of like get tweaked like this or whatever. That impression rarely evolves very much. So like you can start with like an image very early on in the project and very late in the project, and maybe the architect will look at it and see all the different ways that the building has changed and evolved. The sort of emotional impact of those images can be quite similar. And that's really important, because when you're working on a marketing set of images that has construction documents behind it and you have all the details and everything selected, and you're just like trying to focus on reality, that's one exercise, but sometimes we have to get to that same level and the design is hardly even completed. I mean, a lot of times we get a brief that's like, hey, can you do images in 2 weeks? And you're like, sure, yes, we can do that. Can you send us the model? And they're like, oh, we haven't even started designing yet. Like, we'll send it to you in a week. And so we still have to we have the responsibility to create that impression while we're sort of like building the thing at the same time. And that can be a little bit crazy.
That's so cool. Let's talk about, I like to call it selling architecture. And let's start at the very beginning of creating that image, that first or last impression. When you're creating that first image, whether you have a finished design or not, and it's going to be the image that the public might judge the whole project by. What happens in your mind? How do you decide what emotion or what message that image has to kind of carry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's not really for us to decide, right? Like it's, like when we work with our clients, instead of having them say like, here's where we want you to point the camera and here's what we want the lighting to look like and here's this, and like, instead of having them focus on like telling us kind of like what buttons to push to get the kind of image, we'll often focus on two other things. We'll say like, what are the goals for this image? So like, is it to like explain something or communicate something or show a certain thing? And then what sort of other type of imagery or music or art or whatever has the kind of emotional resonance that you would like to create with this image? So it's like sometimes, right, those are like references that can sometimes be a landscape reference or product or a room or something that maybe has very little to do with like what the final image will look like. So if we kind of start with like the goals and then the emotional references, then we often end up with images that the client is quite happy with and is quite different from what they imagined in their head. And that is, that's usually kind of like where we start with the process of just the whole kind of image making process and how you kind of sell architecture. So especially like with architects and a lot of developers are like trained architects, the way that you represent a project as an architect is meant to be explanatory. It's meant to say, right, that's how we get trained in architecture school. If you remember, it's like stand on the corner, 2-point perspective, don't crop any part of the building, and make sure that like the horizon line, the vanishing point is sort of like within the frame. There's like these rules about how you do a rendering. That's when you're trying to like explain to someone what the whole building is doing, and you really just, it needs to be kind of comprehensive. Our best images and our favorite images and our clients' favorite images, I mean, you can look at like the examples in the back, they rarely show the whole building, right? They're, because you really see a whole building when you're experiencing it. So for us, it's like, oh, we really want to show the experience of this building from the water, and we want to, you know, have there be like a connection to nature. Okay, well, we can do that by finding those bits and pieces and putting them together and kind of composing them, as opposed to just like saying, here's the whole building, here's the whole site, here's the whole thing, here's the whole. So we rarely try and do everything within one image. That's why we push our clients to do more images, is not because we want to show all sides of the building, but like we want the set of images to work together to tell a story, as opposed to having each image try to tell the whole story. And so it's a little bit of like a tasting menu, right? Where like each thing kind of gives you a little bit of a different complex flavor that like taken together gives you a really beautiful impression of a meal, versus trying to have like 4 different main entrees that are each trying to find balance within each thing. So it's a slightly different approach, and our favorite projects and our favorite sets of images approach it that way, where each image within a set of 5 or 6 images has like a really, really specific goal. And then taken together, you kind of find synergy between those.
It's so nice to listen to you while I look at the images in the background. How much do you feel like your job is technical, or like, well, very computer heavy, and I guess there's kind of a lot of programming, or however you want to call it.
Yeah.
And how much do you feel like you're still designing and you're an artist putting together the pieces to create that image?
I think it's like a balance. I mean, it's definitely a balance. I forget who I was talking to about this, about just like the value of hand sketching and how that doesn't go away. So, I mean, you call it hand sketching, even if you're drawing, like, I think on the computer with the mouse, I think it's still the same exercise of like just trying to use simple lines to like explain what you're doing. So I'll often do that is like how, kind of compose an image or generate an idea for an image, just like with a very simple sketch. And I had this very cool architecture professor who would do crits with like a really tiny, small little pad of Post-its, and so he was always like sketching on this tiny little pad of Post-it notes. And his whole thing was about like trying to create really, really simple diagrams. And he's like, if you can't diagram the idea and have it fit on this little Post-it, then maybe it's like a little too complicated. And it was like, whatever, either valid or not, but it's just a way to think about something sort of first with your brain and your hand and then go into all that. And so I think that the sort of thesis of that approach, which is something that you learn as an architect, and a lot of architects will still stand behind sketching something out, even if it is a waterproofing detail. I mean, I love sketching construction details. I love thinking through how the parts and pieces are going to align and the waterproofing is going to follow the structure and the sheathing. Like, that's actually a great joy because you kind of think about that and then you use the computer to produce. So you'll hear a lot of people like talk about that. And I think that's still valid for what we do in the visualization world. So some people who are good or have a background in like thinking through that with their pen, I think still do that. And then that, if you want to oversimplify, like how are we using whatever, generative technology, AI, Midjourney, all this stuff, that's kind of where it slots in for me and for a lot of people in our studio, is like using that process to think through an approach before you jump into the computer, before you just sort of like start backwards and say, here's the details. How do we create a cool image? It's always like, what's the impression that you're trying to create? Now let's use the tools to get there. So I think that's a very, very, very common thing. And I think good architects, good technical architects, good design architects have some sort of process that they lean on for being able to translate the ideas and the impression that you want to generate, and then use the technical tools sort of second. I think that's a pretty common theme from a lot of the sort of best designers that I've talked to.
And I like how you focus on that big impression, because obviously when you're the architect, as you go into details, it's always important to drag yourself out of the project again, to look at the big vision and impression you want to create with the building. Do you think your images, are they kind of just visuals, or do they influence real decisions?
I think they definitely do. I think a lot of times we're working on images and the client gives us the design and we show, we do a draft rendering and they're like, oh yeah, that doesn't look good at all. Okay, we're going to go back and we're going to redesign that aspect of it. And then they send us a new 3D model. Or, I mean, a lot of our team, we have like 40 people on our team. A lot of people on our team are trained as architects, come from an architecture background. And so that's also something where that can work in one of two ways. They can say, oh, that's not really working. Like, let's revise the window spacing like this. And they'll just kind of create a sketch and then we'll just model that. Or sometimes they're kind of at one extreme too. They'll be like, we have to like figure out this piece. We'll design it. Sometimes they just like don't get to it or it's delayed or something. And then we're just like, how about this? What if we did a canopy into this? And how about the windows like it? And so we'll kind of like put our foot forward. And sometimes they'll be like, oh yeah, that's great. That looks great. A lot of times with details, right? Because if it's a competition and they're figuring out sort of general form, and sometimes, good images typically come from a high level of detail, regardless of style. And so we like to add a lot of detail for things like windows and doors and mullions and pavers and plants and all these different kinds of things that a lot of those decisions might not be made. So we input where we can, but we try not play designer, but we sort of orchestrate a little bit behind the scenes, but still make it collaborative. But I think one thing that we're very good at is learning to think like our clients. And for our clients, I mean, MA, more Sajami Architects, which is a great collaborator and client of ours. I mean, I worked there for a long time before joining Bloom. And so when we work with them, it's this incredible shorthand because we know how they think, we know their design process, we're very comfortable with that. So we are most comfortable in what we do in a day-to-day when we're working with a long-time collaborator. Many of our clients are like, we've worked with them on many projects. And so we know how they think, and each architect is a little bit different. Their process is a little bit different. And so we can sort of put our hat on in that mode and then try and kind of like approach things how they would.
Just a quick reality check. If you're constantly over-delivering, working around the clock, and still chasing the right kind of projects, you're not alone. I keep meeting architects, interior designers, and contractors in that exact cycle, which is actually why we started Market Your Architecture. We help you reposition your work and get in front of more of the right people, so you can finally choose who you want to work with. If that sounds interesting to you and you want to know more about us, you'll find the link to marketyourarchitecture.com in the description. Lucas, you've worked in sustainable architecture for many years. What parts of that mindset have stayed with you, and how do they kind of influence the images you create today?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously the theme of this podcast is about kind of green architecture, sustainability as such a broad sense of themes. But I mean, so Colombia is where I was born. That's where most of my family still lives. So, Medellin is known as like they have perfect weather all year round. It's a tropical climate, and it's a city embedded in a jungle, right? So it's a big city, and it like is embedded in the mountains in a jungle. The first impression that I have about architecture and landscape is that they're kind of really merged into one. And then when I went to like Oregon and had a formal training in how to think about sustainability, it was a lot of that, right? Sustainability was about high performing buildings, but really at Oregon it was about sort of like nature and organic architecture and sort of the patterns that make for good buildings. When I started practicing in Portland, like I mentioned earlier, that was such a systems-based approach to sustainability. It was about high-performance buildings, and it was about working very closely with the engineers to like make the buildings high-performing, and then kind of using nature to like integrate that. And I remember from my early days at GBD, like the building it was like our spirit animal that became sort of a very often quoted or referenced project was the Banish's the IBN, the Institute for Nature and Forestry Research in the Netherlands, which like I think opened in the late 90s. And it's this beautiful building that is like just very one with nature. It's a sort of organized around a set of courtyards. It's an extremely high performing building, like from a systems point of view, but then like nature sort of just like weaves its way in and out. And I just remember being a young architect in Portland and seeing that, photos of that building as we would talk about like our own schemes and just being like, this is perfection, right? This is as good as you can get as designing a building in this world, because it's like, a healthy enclosure, integration with nature, all these different themes that like sort of stuck with us. So then flash forward kind of to my experience at more Sajmi Architects in New York and thinking about cities and all these things, and then ultimately working with Bloom, which is actually a German studio. So Bloom was founded in Hamburg, Germany, and now has an office in Hamburg, Berlin, and then as of 2 years ago, New York, to work with a German firm in some ways is a little bit full circle from my experience in Portland, because just everything culturally, design-wise, it's about sort of like high performance systems, but that should also just be beautiful and work well. And so like just the whole approach to sustainability in some ways has come full circle working with a German company. And I mean, one of the things that I love is being able to like go to Germany and have my colleagues from Germany come here to New York. And it is this exchange that's just it's sometimes just very, very funny. So like we actually just did like a little home exchange with one of my colleagues in the Hamburg office, and they live this like in this beautiful house, like beautiful Schuko window wall system, and it's like little bungalows, like triple pane glass, like tons of light and everything. And they're here in our like apartment in Brooklyn, and they're like, it's really hot. How do we like turn the radiators down? And I'm like, just open the window, because like the radiators are just like on, like come October, the radiators just turn on. They'll turn off at some point in like May or something like that. And so from someone who may or may not even be a practicing architect, but is like living in like Northern Europe, that is like the bed of like high performance architecture, the idea of just like opening a window in the middle of winter is like shocking. It's like, that's literally, you're like sending energy out the window. And I was like looking at some numbers too earlier. The carbon footprint of someone who lives in New York versus, Berlin is kind of the same, because there's different ways to approach that, like it may be a similar goal. So I guess to kind of sum all that up, just in terms of my own personal take on sustainability, I think all of the different parts and pieces about nature, high performance, efficiency, but then also like working with a European firm where it's not just about sustainability for sustainability's sake and kind of greenwashing. It's also about, first and foremost, like I said, like this theme of creating an impression. All of that, to me, because I am someone who cares a lot about sustainability and the environment and cities and urbanism and all the things that I think are just like important. It does sort of start to spiral into a short list of things that I think I talked to you about, which was, how do you make an image feel sustainable? So if there's an architect that if Banish had come to us and said, we wanted you to do renderings of the IBM building, how would we have approached that? And so for us, it's about kind of creating an impression that takes so many of those things that may be a little bit abstract or technical or this or that, and bringing it down to like a few key ideas as it relates to quote unquote sustainable images, which I had written these down. It's like approach to light. Like often it's about like very advanced approach to natural light, daylighting that's often quite balanced, materiality. So making sure that whatever materials are helping drive the story of the architecture are being focused on, the overall tonal qualities of the image, and then integration with nature. And so we have those things to lean on as we kind of compose an image and start to arrange things and set up cameras and frame things and lighting conditions and all these things, so that if they're, when we're approaching images that want to like kind of convey those same themes, that's how we do it. Shocker, like any good images, sustainable architecture or not, those tools are still going to make for a compelling image. And so I think that, to me, it ultimately gets back to this idea that whether it's a sustainable building or not, or this, that, or the other thing, when you approach architecture from a way of enhancing the user's experience, you create an emotional resonance for that. And so, it's like, I think this is a beautiful image behind me. This is for a competition. It does things like showing its connection to nature and the water and like a site. Like, it's hard to understand whether or not, that's recycled wood or old growth timber. Like, who knows? That's a little bit hard to understand. But I think for the most part, the strategies are the same. Is if you're trying to kind of convey these ideas about sort of being sensitive to nature and the environment, and then being gracious with then how that's represented on the interior of the architecture, I think you're naturally going to end up with good images if you kind of keep those themes in mind and make sure that the principles that are driving the architecture are also expressed in how you generate the images.
I love your holistic approach to all of this, and how you combine your background with your current work. It's really cool to see. What advice would you then give an architect who's trying to sell a sustainable project? Because what I hear so often is, yeah, we could make it more sustainable because the client didn't want to. What advice would you give them to sell their project better?
I really believe in just the power of like a good image that will make someone somewhere latch onto something, and then they kind of like rarely let it go. Like, I have small kids. You can't really say a bad word in front of them, because like 2 weeks later they'll be like, "What's this word mean?" And you're just like, "Oh man, I didn't realize that." So sometimes you leave this little impression that it just like sticks in someone's mind. So selfishly, I'm like, if there's this part of it that you really think is important, say it's like a PV array on the roof or something like that, I think the best thing you can do is like lean into that and create an image that highlights that. And you might talk to an architect like, "Oh yeah, we want like this view, but like we're not sure if the PV thing is going to be in the project, and so maybe we should do a different view, because then it's like, what if it has to come out?" Okay, you can play it safe and say, okay, let's frame a camera that gives you some flexibility so you can have PV or not as the project goes on. We don't know if it's going to make the VE process, and let's play it safe. But again, to be in that role of just being like, well, why not create like the coolest image ever that highlights the PV array, so then you can't cut it out, because like at some point, so many people have seen it that way that now that is the project. That is the heart and soul of the thing. Totally selfish, maybe, right? Because it's like there's so many moving parts and pieces and stakeholders and things like that. And like, who are we to give that strategic approach, which might be misguided? But at the end of the day, like everyone who's reviewing a project and this, that, or other thing is like a person, right? They're just looking at these things and they're finding their own inspiration. They're latching onto things and they're figuring out what they want to invest their time and money in. And I think if we can just like, I don't know, inspire people or create something cool, or just for us, it's not about owning the strategy. For us, it's just about trying to say like, well, you're the one telling me that you believe this, right? You're our client. So the architect, the landscape architect, the interior, like you're telling us that this is really important. Like lean in, like let us try and focus on this. And so you see that a lot with things like a PV array or a skylight or a roof garden or a this or that or the other thing. And, to come back to this kind of holistic approach to design and image making, those things, I mean, PV arrays are a little bit weird, right? Because it's like they are a very technical thing. But something like a skylight or reflecting pond or garden or roof garden, these are all things that are just going to actually heighten the emotional connection between the viewer and the image. So they're both sustainability strategies, but like I mentioned, they are actually things that are going to create more compelling images, more interesting storylines, and more opportunities to find a way to really get into someone's heart through the imagery. So like, as opposed to playing it safe and hedging your bets in case it doesn't make the VE round, it's like, let's just do it. And then if we have to revise the images later, we'll revise them. But let's like lean in and try and make the most beautiful imagery possible. And if that tool that is helping us create a beautiful image is also helping make a building more sustainable, then we're happy. Then that's great, right? That's wonderful. And I think the more that we can approach it that way, where we just sort of like have some kind of courage to represent the things that we really believe in, I just think that's every piece of beautiful, inspiring architecture or art that I've ever experienced or been around had some sort of element of like courage behind it, right? Of people being like, this is what I believe in, this is what we should do. And I think that that's a really important thing that's harder and harder to do in our industry, because there's so many influences and so much uncertainty that it really takes some gumption to like just stand behind something. But the good architects that we work with aren't afraid. They believe in themselves, and then we are inspired by that, which then helps us. We get some courage out from them, and then we sort of help them say, you know what, let's just do it. Let's show the garden. Like, it'll be cool. It'll be a cool image. If we have to cut it out later, we'll cut it out. But let's at least show it. And when we have those opportunities, it's quite fun.
So cool that you encourage them or remind them to have the courage and to take on leadership of the project. And I do think as well that we need to make the sustainable parts kind of an exciting part of the project. And if we can do that through an image, then that's what's it gonna be, right? Tell me about your favorite or your most challenging projects.
There's favorite projects that are like sort of visually favorite, but then there's, like I said, I love working on projects in New York. And the projects that we work on in New York, we've had the benefit of on working on some that are like really quite impactful, that are going to really shape our city. I mean, we've worked with a firm called OFTN that had partnered with Big to like look at the whole waterfront for Manhattan, right? Like, what's the future of that? So we've done some images for them for like the renovation or the visioning of the whole sort of lower Manhattan, Fidei seaport waterfront, which is, it's like, how do we make the waterfront better and more accessible and integrate gardens and bike paths and programmable areas, but it's also part of a resiliency strategy to protect lower Manhattan against rising ocean, like sea levels. So it's like you can kind of do both, right? You can have like the whole perimeter of the island be like cool park space, and it can actually like raise the sort of resiliency level for the entire city. So those projects are really amazing when we get to be part of those. There's also like the Governor's Island, the Climate Exchange, the New York Climate Exchange that we have partnered with SOM to create those images. I mean, this is going to be a whole institution dedicated to the research of climate resiliency. And it's going to be a place where people can sort of, quote unquote, study abroad or have a fellowship, but here in New York City. I mean, we all love a project that's like on whatever 48th Street and Fifth Avenue or something. I don't know. I don't even know what's there, but projects that are like in the city that are very like quote unquote New Yorky, very like embedded in what it looks like to have a piece of architecture in New York. Those are cool. Everyone loves those. And our team in Germany loves working on those, right? Because it really feels cinematic. Like, oh yeah, this is like classic New York. I love those. Those are great. But big cities are complicated animals full of strange nooks and crannies and underbellies and overlapping things that are sort of pseudo-owned by various city institutions that then people have been planning what this could be for 20 years. And those weird little in-between spaces, those like little alleyways, as it were, metaphorically, are extraordinarily interesting. And I think they have a huge part in shaping what cities become. And all these types of projects like the Waterfront Resiliency or this Climate Exchange Center in Governor's Island, I think fill that little weirdness niche for me, where they're just these strange bits of land or property, or like, did you know that a new park just opened under the Brooklyn Bridge and it's like 9 acres? Like, that's crazy. Like, there's these things that are hiding in plain sight, and you sort of drive past them or ride your bike past them or walk past them as you experience the city. And then projects pop up all the time, and those projects change the face of the city in a very, very big way, kind of instantly, kind of overnight, as it were, as they open. So when we have a chance to work on those, I love working on those projects, because you're like, did you know that like they're going to build a whole thing on Governor's Island? And you're talking to your friends who are in New York, and you're like, oh no, I have no idea, that's crazy. Those are really fun. Those are the interesting ones for us.
That's so cool. I envy you that you're so much at the kind of pulse of the industry, and you work on some of the most important projects right now. It's really cool.
Yeah, it's, like I said, we get to be famous by association, right? We get to take responsibility for these, and I can give you the list of all the amazing projects and stuff. But like at the end of the day, our actual physical responsibility in terms of, if you just want to say like in terms of dollars for the life of a project, is like breadcrumbs. It's very, very small, but we do get to sit at the table and have a direct line of communication with the architects and the developers working on these things. And in a good collaboration, they trust us, right, as partners. And we do have a responsibility for that. And that feels great.
I mean, in terms of dollars, it is a small breadcrumb, but in terms of impact, it is very, very important for the project, for the city, for everyone involved.
Yeah, I liked it. My dad had this like funny metaphor that he was like, the two things you should always spend money on and never skimp on your car are your tires and your brake pads. Because those things at the end of the day will save your life, and if tires or whatever, $500, $1,000 or whatever, don't try and get a deal. Don't try and get them for $4. Just like pay the money and you'll be fine. But like, skimp on other stuff. I think about that sometimes, it's like just a funny metaphor in the back of my head sometimes. And I'm like, you've invested, talking to a client, like you've invested thousands and millions of dollars in this project, and you will invest many, many more. And you're asking many people to invest many, many, many more. And we're like the tires or the brake pads. Like sometimes we lose a project over $1,000 or something like that in our fee. And I'm like, I hope it wasn't the money. That like it's pretty minuscule at the end of the day, but I think it just comes down to like having a partnership with someone that you can trust, and there's mutual trust and all these different kinds of things. Cause that's what's really interesting. So yeah, in some ways I do feel a huge responsibility for that, because it's like, if this project gets published, like that's the thing that people see. So like we better treat that as if it was our $500 million being invested as well, because it's like, that is what someone who is in that role is also depending on our images to communicate their vision. So we feel that a little bit.
That's so cool. I have one last question for you, and that's technology related. You know, there's so much talking about, or so much information as well about how resource intensive tech is, and especially rendering, we know it is resource intensive. Do you ever think about the carbon footprint of the process itself, or do you focus more on the impact that your work then has on the architecture and on the built environment?
Both. I mean, how can you not, and I mean, rendering in and of itself is a very energy intensive process. It requires a very good computer. It requires very good graphics cards, and many of them. And people often forget that a computer is like a thing that generates a lot of heat. So like, just from a very practical point of view, like our server room that has all of our computers is like, it just needs to be cooled constantly. And so just our little tiny little company, which is a speck on this earth, it's like we're concerned about that, right? So what do? We have it in a room where we can like open the windows and it's cooled naturally most of the year, because it's in Hamburg, which is in this like Nordic environment. So it's like free cooling. A very simple principle, right? Passive cooling, passive heating, passive ventilation, like can still be applied, because otherwise that would be like a huge electricity bill. Once you start to carry that line of thinking in terms of, every time you like put something in ChatGPT or Midjourney or like Nano Banana or like all the new things, that we're using, I mean, who knows where they go and what happens with them, but that there's some computers out there generating a lot of heat, consuming a lot of energy, consuming a lot of water. And it is a huge concern. In some ways, we have to do that to understand what the possibilities of it are, and then figure out how do we optimize our use of these tools. Are we using them in a responsible way, in a way that they should be used? Are we using them excessively? Are we leaning on things? Are we not? This or that or whatever. So we have to kind of know what we need from them. And then I think we have to react to whatever information we have about a more responsible approach to them. So whether that's like legislation or best practices or guidance within the industry or firms, or like there are companies that have research and development departments that are much larger than ours that sort of create guidance for these things or write white papers. And we read that stuff and we respond to it and we change our practices accordingly. But yeah, I don't know that there's a good, healthy answer for now, because I think the answer of having a sort of blackout approach to it is not something we can kind of do right now. But we certainly aren't like, what's the new one, the Sora, the video making one that just sort of generates stuff for the sake of like endless engagement. I mean, I'm not very interested in that. So we're kind of interested in the technology as it helps us get to our sort of overall mission faster and better, but not sort of interested in a gluttonous consumption of it for any reason, right? It's just about balance. It's about trying to find a balance. And as more information comes out and there's like maybe a new AI tool will come out that's like a sort of, that's focused on sustainability, on sustainable server farms or something. I mean, sure, sign me up. But I think we can kind of only react to what's in front of us. I mean, I'd love if you know what your thoughts are on that, or as other people have thoughts on that. I mean, I'm all ears.
I don't know yet of any good sustainability tool that helps us also create less or have a lower carbon impact. But I do know, for example, I had the sustainability expert of Autodesk on the podcast, and she showed me 2 tools that help you make a more sustainable project, which I think is super interesting, not maybe for your work, but when you start designing the project, so you can really look at the impact the passive architecture has, but also all the materials and all the elements you use. So that's really cool.
Yeah. That's definitely interesting. I mean, there's 2 sides of it, right? It's like how the tool helps you get to a better place, and then like what the tool is actually like consuming. I actually heard on the radio yesterday, there was like a study that said that like all the combined whatever AI tools that are using are equivalent to like the amount of energy that like 6 million Americans use, which is crazy. So I don't know how much like our sliver is as like a company or as an individual, but I know that whenever a truly sustainable, meaning something that is actually a good option, that is an alternative, I know as soon as something like that comes out, then we'll jump on that, right? Because given the choice between driving or taking a bike or taking mass transit, when you have the options, you use them and you have power in choice. And so I think it's a little hard because we are in many ways in the middle of this kind of like arms race, this technological arms race, as architects and as designers and as developers, to like adopt the latest thing and do this and blah, blah, blah. And a lot of that is coming from our clients who really, as technology advances and the ability to create the images sort of faster and quicker and of higher quality, it's not so much like a downward pressure on the fee that we get, actually. It's like an upward pressure on the expectation for quality and the responsiveness of the revisions. So as it gets easier to revise a rendering and change someone from wearing a black coat to a red coat, it's not like a client is like, oh, now it's so easy to change, I'm going to pay you less for that. It's like, oh, I used to get 2 revisions, now I want 10 revisions because like I know it's easy to change. So it's the same thing if you remember from like when we were adopting BIM, when it went from AutoCAD to like Revit, And it's like, oh, this is going to be so much easier because you can model the thing and then you can do a floor plan and a section and an elevation at the same time. Well, it wasn't easier, just actually raised the expectation from the client in terms of the amount of information that was documented, because it's like now you have the responsibility to be able to document all these kinds of things. So we're in a little bit of that too, where everyone's expectation for the quality and the level of realism and then how many times they get to change things is increasing. And so we are less of in a position to be able to use these tools to just have a bunch of extra free time. It's not that. It's actually to respond to like an actually more educated and elevated sort of client base that is expecting more from us. And I think we're all in that position, right?
Yeah, that's interesting that you mentioned it. And you mentioned Midjourney, Nana Banana. What are your favorite AI tools?
I mean, the ones that are really cool are the ones that are converting still images to films. I think that's very interesting. I think the ones that are integrating directly into Photoshop are powerful because then they sort of align with the workflow. I get less excited about a new tool that does something specific that the tool wants you to do, because these things get adopted very quickly, right? And a lot of the information, I mean, it's like, I joke that, it's very hard to have industry secrets when most of the times we're learning things from like a 15-year-old on YouTube that just does some tutorial and you're like, this is awesome. And it's like, we're all watching that, right? Like everyone in our industry, from small studios to big studios, are all have access to the same tools and the same information. So it's less about that, right? If like a new Midjourney model comes out, then pretty soon all Midjourney images kind of look the same like that. So it's less about being excited about that. But when the tools come out that allow us to do something that we want to do kind of in our mind's eye better, that's very exciting. So if like there's something that, like the thing that's crazy about Nano Banana is that you can like tell it to like, show me what the back of this building would look like. And so it lets you explore things in a non 3D space in a way that's very loose and very quick. And so that's exciting because that's what I want it to do, not what it's kind of telling me to do. So it always makes the suggestion, it's always like you open it up and it's like, Gemini's like, take your headshot and make it look like a corporate headshot. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. Like, don't tell me what to do, because then like, that's like everyone is doing that and everything looks the same. So I'm interested in more exploring it. And we have like a way to discuss that internally in terms of like, what are you doing and how does this work? And like, did you try that? And actually, what if you do this and combine it with that? Like that gets this interesting result. So the ability to use these as in a not very prescriptive way is actually more interesting, where it's just like, what's the best kitchen tool in the entire world is like a beautiful chef's knife, right? Something that has no protocol. It's just perfect in terms of quality, and it actually creates more options as opposed to like the worst thing in the world is like an avocado slicer. It just does one thing. It just does one thing. And if you don't have avocados, you can't use it. So that's what some of these AI tools are for me. They're just these very, very specific things that aren't that interesting once you get over like the gimmick of it.
Very interesting point of view. I think we could have an entire separate conversation about AI and how that's limiting or boosting our creativity. But we're going to wrap it up here. If our listeners want to find out more about you, follow your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, so our website is great. We just relaunched it this summer, and it's full of a new approach to how we're thinking about this, which is much more in line to everything that I've talked about, which is kind of like our whole values as a company and as a studio. So our new website is focused on sets of images with film, still images, and writing that really describes in a very specific way our creative point of view about the image making process for that specific set of images. So it goes beyond describing what the architecture is trying to do, and it's really focusing on what we're trying to do when we're creating the images. And that was a really amazing exercise, which was a huge effort for us for the first part of this year. So that's bloomimages.de. And that has sort of all of our best and latest and favorite projects all on there.
It actually reminds me of a book. It's like just this beautiful website that you could scroll through for hours, just looking at the beautiful and well curated images.
That's exactly the concept for it, is that it's meant to feel a little bit like a bookshelf or like a magazine stand, where there's kind of a cover image that for us encapsulates that impression, right? That's the image that gives like the impression. And then as you click on each one, you get to explore more images from that project. And there's a wide range of types of images in there. So again, it's not about showing all four sides of the building, but it's about zooming in and out and exploring different points of view and different vantage points and detail shots, and then blended with reference images and writing, so that you get hopefully a very holistic view and a strong emotional connection with that project. So that is really, it was a huge effort for us to go from what in our industry would be kind of just like a splash pad of just all amazing images, to go to something that is really taking a deeper dive into each specific project. And it was a way for us to have to articulate our own point of view, and again, like stand behind it and just say, this is how we feel things should happen in a holistic way.
It's really like traveling through the project. I'm gonna link the website in the description of the episode. Thank you so much, Lucas, for sharing all your insights. It's been a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, thanks to you. I really appreciate it. It was fun.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at LatinaShip. Thanks.